Right, hello everybody. What I'm trying to do today is I'm going to try and do a 5-minute example presentation of something that you can potentially do. I'm going to do this on a topic we haven't covered yet, which is Margaret Thatcher, just because obviously the topics we have covered, you can always go back and look at the slides and look at the reading and the sources that you've already utilised. But I thought I'd pick a later topic that we're going to look at today. So what I want to try and do is showcase what the whole group could do, and then I'm going to give a particular example of maybe what one student could do. However, please do not copy, and I will obviously know if you have, please do not copy my slides if you do choose Thatcher's topic, and particularly what I'm going to talk about today, Thatcher's electoral success. So I'm going to pull a PowerPoint screen up now, so you probably won't see my face again, but I'll talk to this, and effectively I want to try and do 5 minutes in the middle. I hope it times right, 5 minutes in the middle about what one student could potentially speak about. So here we go. Here's the slideshow as is. So basically speaking, I'm not going to do this as a timed piece of work at first, but this is an example of what an introductory slide could look like for your group. So obviously the groups haven't been assigned yet. They will be assigned in short order. But in essence, this is the Britain from the Boer of Brexit presentation. My group that I've made up has decided that we're going to do Thatcher. This is an example. I would insert the names potentially whoever's in my group at the bottom to showcase this is our presentation. As I've said in some of the other videos and some of the seminars, you want to try and get every member of the group clearly has to speak for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. I would advise you don't want to really go over that. And if you've got more members in your group, you might want a slightly shorter spot. Everyone has to speak, everyone has to do their own bit, but equally for the other parts of what you need to do as a group, you can divvy those roles up however you see. So the other roles that we've had in the past, we've talked about, a group secretary, someone who takes the minutes of your meetings, if you have these meetings on Teams or Zoom or Skype or WhatsApp, Facebook, whatever it is, have someone who takes the minutes of how often you met, when you met, and who turned up, and potentially who didn't. It is acceptable to submit apologies if you can't make meetings. People have childcare commitments, work commitments, family commitments, etc. Entirely acceptable if you've missed 1 or 2. And if someone's clearly not engaged throughout the whole process, do make a record of it so that if and when a group mark is assigned, that can potentially be taken into account. So group secretary could be an important role. You might also have a person in the group who puts the PowerPoint together to hopefully make it look nice and image friendly, something that looks positive. You might have somebody in the group who wants to do the introduction, because you're going to need somebody to speak before the 3, 4, 5 of you speak as an introduction. I'm going to give you an example of that now. You might also want the same person or maybe a different person to do the conclusion. So I mean the overall introduction to the whole presentation of all 3, 4, 5 individuals, and an overall conclusion for all 3, 4, 5 individuals. I'll give you an example of both today. So in essence, if we were doing this presentation, I would say something like, if I was the person who was doing the introduction, so I've been assigned the introduction, welcome to the presentation from the Thatcher group. This is, student 1, student 2, student 3, and student 4. We're going to take you through a little bit of an oversight into how Margaret Thatcher's rule of Britain from 1979 to 1990 went down. So I'm the introduction person, so I'm going to say a little bit before anybody gets their actual presentation themselves. So a very brief introduction at the topic. This doesn't need to be incredibly immersed in the scholarship, but if you can include 1 or 2 things, great. But you don't have to at this point, but try and make sure that you're doing that in the individual sections. And I've got many examples of that when I get to my 5-minute section shortly. So a very brief introduction will be something like this. Margaret Thatcher served as Britain's Prime Minister for 11 years between 1979 and 1990. He's often regarded as one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. There have been a number of academic studies, such as the London School of Economics, but also the University of Leeds, that have regarded Thatcher as maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th best prime minister in the modern era. She was an MP for a substantial period of time before this. She was an MP from 1959, but didn't become leader of the country, the prime minister, until 1979, and became leader of the Conservative Party 4 years before that. Had some ministerial experience before she became prime minister. He served as Secretary of State for Education and Science, both in a shadow and in a governmental capacity. So what our group is going to do for the presentation, student 1, who is myself, I'm going to speak about Thatcher's electoral success for 4 or 5 minutes. Then student 2 is going to move on and look at Thatcher and the unions. Student 3 is going to look at Thatcher and the economy. Student 4, Thatcher and foreign affairs, a bit about the Falklands, about the special relationship in that one. And student 5 is going to look at the Labour Party in the Thatcher era to try and understand some of the whys behind Margaret Thatcher ruling for 11 years and the Conservative Party themselves actually ruling for 18. So moving on, what we're going to do next is the 5-minute presentation example. So I'm going to be informal for a second here and just have a bit of a talk. In essence there, The person who was deciding the introduction doesn't have to be the first person who presents. But in this example, I said I'm student one, so I'm going to present this. I am now going to try and speak for no more than 5 minutes. I'll try and be as brief as possible, but also as detailed as possible about Thatcher's electoral success, because that's the group topic that I've chosen in my imaginary group with 5 people. And I've showed there what the other 4 are going to be doing, but I'm going first. And I'm going to talk about Thatcher's electoral success. So I'll do my absolute best to try and get this in within a 5-minute time. Don't worry if you go a little bit over or a little bit under, but what we absolutely don't want is somebody speaking for 10 minutes, because in essence, these group presentations are meant to be about 15 minutes long. So I've said, if there's 2, 5 minutes each. If there's 4 of you, you might want to mention 4 minutes. When the groups are decided and assigned, we can work this out. I won't punish anybody in an individual group who speaks for 5 minutes, because I've given you a 5-minute example here. However, if you are speaking for substantially longer, this may be reflected in your feedback, because you have been told very much 5 minutes is your max. So I'm going to try and fill that and speak for 5 minutes, and I hope this goes well, because this is live. So, starting now, my presentation is going to look at Margaret Thatcher and her electoral success. And as you can see from the slide here, and the graph on the left-hand side is from the House of Commons 2020 paper on British elections. This showcases that Margaret Thatcher is the most successful British Prime Minister in terms of the number of election victories she actually achieved and the number of years in office she spent. What I'm going to do is talk about her elections in 1979, 1983, and 1987, and then student 1, student 2, and student 3 are going to look a bit more in depth at some of the problems of Thatcher's power and also some of the successes that took place within Thatcher's period of government. So I'm going to split this into 3 sections. The first section is going to be Thatcher and the 1979 election, then the 83 election, then the 87 election, and then a conclusion. So how did Margaret Thatcher win in 1979? Obviously, the Labour Party were in power for 5 years before this period, from 74 to 79, so there has to be a change of government for Thatcher into power. The major factor was the winter of discontent. The winter of discontent was a period where a lot of Britain went on strike due to pay policy disputes, particularly with the trade unions, and this showed the Labour Party potentially as somebody who didn't have a handle on these issues within the country. This led to high unemployment, high inflation, and industrial strikes, and really impacted on the vast majority of Britons. 3 primary sources have access for this. The Guardian stated in 1979 that Thatcher's victory was as positive an affirmation of faith as the British ever contrived for 3 decades, so it's a big, major victory. The Economist in the same year said people would vote for change, and the New Statesman said for the Labour, it's not a defeat, it's a disaster, because Labour have gone just so far backwards. A few academics have also looked at would be Anthony King, who have said that the Labour Party need to start showing great respect for the British electorate. David Marquand, who says, was Labour doomed to permanent decline after this period because 1979 is such a bad defeat? But the most convincing argument, in my view, would be Butler and Kavanagh's argument that there's no swing to the right in this election. It's actually an example of not people necessarily going towards the Conservatives, but away from the Labour Party. You can see on the right there, I've got a BBC Gallup survey, which is showcasing a primary source here, that realistically Britain's very split on the way that it's thinking about issues such as taxation and government welfare, etc. So that's the 1979 election. Margaret Thatcher also wins the 1983 election, but some of the issues at this election are slightly different. You can argue one of the continuities is that Labour are as unpopular potentially as they were in 1979, if not more so. Gerald Kaufman, who was the MP for Manchester Broughton, said that Labour's own manifesto in 1983 was the longest suicide note in history because it was such a left-wing manifesto. There were numerous problems for Labour in this period. Dissension at the top is something said by Miller, an academic, in 1984. The arguments between the left and the centre in the Labour Party, which obviously still take place today, were rife in 1983. A major factor as well is the creation of the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, and the split away from Labour in that period. Labour could have potentially pushed for an election in 81 and 82, but they are 43 seats behind. Thatcher has quite a big majority, 79. And Thatcher is able to recover due to a number of things in this period, which some of my colleagues are going to look at later in the presentation. So Abernethy has said that realistically, Thatcher used the worsening situation to bolster her right to stay in the course. But the major factor in Thatcher's victory, argued by a number of academics, as you can see on the slide, would be the Falklands factor. Thatcher was unpopular before the Falklands War started, and by the end of the Falklands conflict, her popularity had boomed, as had the Conservative Party itself. And in general, there have been economic benefits for a number of people in the country, particularly in the 81 to 83 period, not so much in the 79 to 81 period, and that's why Thatcher won in 83. Finally, onto why did Labour lose in 1987? Why did Thatcher win in 1987? Butler and Kavanagh said that Labour actually won the campaign, so how actually did Labour lose the election? Ben Pimlott has said, who's to blame and what can be done to stop Labour ending in opposition forever? Nobody and nothing. Norris has said long-term factors predominated over short-term, so that links back to sort of what I talked about earlier. And Alvarez, Nagler, and Bowler all said that voters made a respective choice of policy in performance. But to me, the primary data gives the most convincing explanation. Ipsos Mori showcased that many people still think Labour are too extreme, too left-wing, and Gallup also showcased that Neil Kinnock was an unpopular leader during this period. So all those factors go in, plus the factors we had in 79 and 83 to deciding how Labour lost this election. So my conclusion to this section, Margaret Thatcher won 3 elections, as we have seen today, due to a combination of Labour Party failures and Conservative Party strengths. Some of Thatcher's key policies in these periods are going to be explored by my colleagues, students 1, 2, and 3. But in conclusion, there can be no doubt that in terms of the number of years in office, Margaret Thatcher was the most successful Prime Minister of the 20th century. Right, that's my bit. I think that was 4 minutes, 50 seconds. Off the top of my head, I luckily did have a little clock at the bottom and I was trying to keep the time as best as possible. What I hope you've seen there that I've tried to do is I've tried to split my mini topic into 3 because it was elections. It was quite easy. I chose 79, 83, and 87 because they're the only 3 general elections that stands in. 92 was under John Major. And then I've also tried to integrate primary sources and academic material throughout. Now, one of the things that I haven't shown yet, but I'm going to show because I'm not going to talk through this, and nor really should you, because I've mentioned so many historians, primary sources, etc., in that presentation, I would expect to see this as a bibliography. Because I do not want you to copy what I have done today, and I would really stress people not do that. I have just put insert articles. I have left out and blanked out the article names on purpose, but I did reference kind of the people that I mentioned. But if you have mentioned someone in the main presentation, either by name or on the slide, make sure you've got this little bibliography slide. But traditionally, when academics give presentations or in this students, you don't need to actually discuss the bibliography slide. Just have it up there and say something like, and there's my bibliography if you need any more information about the sources that I've accessed. And we'll move on to student 2 would be the example that I would give here. So when that's done, so you do this for me, then student 2 would do it, then 3, 4, 5, however many's in your group. Then you'd have an overall conclusion as well. So I'm going to give an example of that. This is not in my 5 minutes. I could do my 5 minutes legitimately. I would also say this, sorry, the slide's a bit slow coming up there. Students 2, 3, and 4 would give their 3 to 5 minutes, but then you have an overall conclusion which tries to tie in some of the views. This doesn't have to go towards your 3, 4, 5 minutes as an individual. This can just be part of a separate piece of work. So whoever's doing this, and this could be a group role, either side, someone who speaks to the conclusion for a minute or 2 might say something like this, they were choosing this topic. So student 1, which was me, showcased how Thatcher's electoral success makes her one of Britain's successful prime ministers. Students 2 and 3 investigated some of these successes and failures within the Thatcher term, including trade union law, such as the 1980 Employment Act, 1982 Employment Act, the miners' strike in 1984, and monetarism and the economic policy of Thatcher throughout this period. Then student 4 built on this by extending it into an investigation into Thatcher's foreign policy, particularly the Falklands, but also the special relationship with the United States. Student 5 broadened the scope out yet further by looking at the other side of the divide in this period, the Labour Party's problems, and this showcases that whilst Thatcher's successes were instrumental in her longevity, so too were the Labour Party's own issues. These also contribute to the Conservatives' continued success between 1979 and 1997. Although she remains a controversial figure, in conclusion, Margaret Thatcher was one of the most significant British Prime Ministers of the modern era. When surveyed in 2004, 10 and 16, academics of the Political Studies Association ranked Thatcher as the second greatest modern leader in Britain, behind only Clement Attlee, and this was from the University of Leeds survey in 2016. And that would be the end. I've tried to come up with a nice round conclusion as a very final line there. But in essence, that's my end. You would have each student potentially in the idea what this would place in front of the class, and everyone kind of potentially could have then fielded any questions. This is why I said to you in a couple of weeks now, I do not mind, I have said, because of the extreme difficult circumstances that we live in at the moment under COVID, I don't mind if you want to do this in terms of recordings. So if you want to do 3, 4, 5 individual recordings of students and say to me when they're sent to me by Dropbox or something, say to me, this is the order that these things are in. However, as I have stressed a few times, I would encourage you to do it live. I know this is more important, but obviously it will be taken into account. I would be aware that if a student is recording something, they could do it 3, 4 times. Make sure that it's perfect and aware that you get one shot at it potentially going live. That would be incredibly taken into account. But the reason I would encourage you to do it live is because of the fact that if you have missed something out, I could potentially ask you a question about it. if you do something that is recorded, it is far more difficult for that to take place. And also, I think it's all, it's possible, but it is potentially more difficult to make sure that everybody sends in their videos on time, to make sure that everybody's videos flow. Whereas if you are doing it live and you are the second speaker, you can say very easily, as shown by Chris there in his first section that looked at the Labour Party's electoral successes, there are reasons behind why Margaret Thatcher was so successful between 1979 and 1990. You can make those links a lot easier than you can if you're doing videos, because otherwise you'd have to wait for everybody who did video 1, then wait for video 2, video 3 to be able to respond in time. But it's entirely up to you. I encourage you to use the video, but I'm by no means going to punish you if you choose that method, if that's what you're most comfortable with. But I do think it gives you more options potentially for anything for a very quick question or two by myself. These will be private live meetings. They would not be meetings that take place with the whole class in the room. I think that's everything that I had. I hope you found this a little useful. I think the general plan is, I've obviously recorded this in advance, but I'm probably going to go through this on the day of the seminar in week 5. But I'm going to put this recording up after in case anyone needs a bit of a refresh. That's why I've blanked out those graphic references so that there can't be anyone copying. So I hope you found that useful. Any questions, as always, please ask me the seminar and or via email. And I shall see you in the seminars. Thank you.